Welcome to the Atheist Christian Book Club.
Do you know where it starts? Where he traces Jesus' birth to?
Do I? No.
Adam. The first Homo sapien. The first Homo sapien appeared about 100,000 years ago. So you're going to trace. We can trace genealogies back 300-400 years. Luke, read it for yourself. Traces it back to Adam. Matthew at least traces it back to just Abraham. Plus, there's a bogus census where everybody goes to their own hometown to register for the census. Do you know where they went? To King David. David ruled in 1000 BC. That would be going to your ancestors 1,000 years before. It would be a mess. And the Romans were very efficient at running government. There's no record of a census. And do you know when Jesus was born? The day Jesus was.
Well, surely December 25th.
No, I mean 0 or 1 or what.
What about 4 BC?
He was born 4 BC, some scholars think, because it says Herod, he was born during the reign of Herod, which he died 4 BC, but he also says, Luke, that it was during the census of Quirinius. Quirinius was the governor of Syria in 6 AD. So you got a 10-year gap. This is not any small error. This is very huge differences. Oh, and by the way, the book we're going to be reading is Bart Ehrman's book, and you'll see in here where that was a big stumbling block to his faith. Jesus Interrupted, and he'll lay out all the inconsistencies.
Hold up, you believe Jesus was born, so what difference does all that make?
He's apocalyptic. And
I mean, that's what I'm saying, though. You're talking about his birth and everything.
Yeah, sure. No,
you will defend the fact that
absolutely, he's a real person, and he came in a culture. This was apocalyptic thinking in Jewish thought began 100 years before Jesus. If you look at John the Baptist, he's like ready to go. This thing's coming down.
He was a failed apocalyptic guy right there.
Yeah, exactly. No kidding. He was beheaded. But Jesus was influenced by John the Baptist's apocalyptic thought. Jesus, and just look at the evidence. The sons of thunder were arguing who's going to sit on your right, who's going to sit on your left. Why are they saying that? Because Jesus had filled their minds with, hey, you guys are going to be like right there. And he actually said, you can read it in the gospel of his parables, you will judge the 12 tribes of Israel. Doesn't the high priest have something to say about that? You're just little fishermen and tax collectors. You're nothing. You're going to rule them. Because his mind was filled with apocalyptic imagery. Oh, and by the way, Bart Ehrman wrote a book, one of his best books, Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium. If you read the book, he lays it all out. What did the rest of y'all think?
Well, do you think that really happened, that the two disciples were arguing and trying to vie for position?
Seems reasonable to me. But, he probably, and by the way, if you read this book, The Five Gospels, and John Dominic Cross, one of the people you mentioned, is a member of this seminar, and 70 scholars, and Christians have absolutely trashed these guys. And it's terrible because this book, if you look at it, you can see where Jesus is talking and where the gospel right just totally invents things.
Just to kind of get the footnote, we just did a profile on Crossan.
Robert Funk.
He's part of the Jesus Seminar, and their claim to fame is very liberal scholars who sit around with colored beads to vote on what parts of the Bible Jesus said and didn't say. Go through the Gospels, and so if Jesus definitely said it, then you put a red bead in the path. If Jesus never said anything close to it, you put a black bead in. So like the entire Gospel of John, only one verse gets pink, which means he may have said something similar to this. So that's the kind of the scholarship. So this is the official Bible, so it's all, basically without the colors, but it's color coded for you to tell you.
And it says the five Gospels.
So
the other
basically,
gospel,
to read John, you only have one verse to worry with, and you've read John already.
And the other gospel, which is the five they believe should be in there, is the Gospel of Thomas, which is 114 sayings of Jesus, which some of them are very close to the synoptics. No passion narrative, where Jesus is crucified or whatever, and no birth narrative. So that's not important enough to include. I mean,
well, and I would never give you a hard time because you know more about the New Testament than I do. But Aren't you kind of also sort of picking and choosing, because you're talking about some things that didn't happen, but then you're talking about the sitting on the right hand and left hand, and you're pretty sure that really happened, so.
Oh, exactly. Well, there's a verse in here where they go, oh yeah, he said that, but then in the same sentence it says, oh, and take up your cross and follow me, or something about the cross.
Yeah.
So obviously he couldn't have said, Jesus would have probably been killed by stoning, not by crucifixion.
The hermeneutic that they use, one of them is what's called criteria of embarrassment. So if it's something that's kind of embarrassing to Christianity or Jesus, he probably said that. But if it's something that seems to be supportive or something like that, like when he prophesied his own death, he obviously couldn't have said that because he didn't know that was going to happen. So if it, and the first thing you remove is all supernatural. So it's an anti-supernatural bias. You pull all the supernatural stuff out first. So Jesus did a miracle. Jesus walked on water. That's gone. And so you're left with a very, very small, core, and then you're back to, the Bible is not inspired, but I'm inspired to spot the spots that might.
Well, you have the criteria of dissimilarity, which means if it sounds like a Christian saying it, it didn't come from Jesus. Jesus was not the first Christian. We're inherited Pauline Christianity. That's the Christianity that won out. Not the James and Peter and the ones that believed in Torah observance, people like the gospel.
But you would agree that Paul really existed,
Oh, absolutely,
and that
yeah.
Paul sat down in Jerusalem with Peter and with James, the half brother.
And in Acts, where they look like, oh, we're all on the same page. It's just
They had disagreements too.
Oh yeah, but it was probably more
But
severe.
they, on the
they
core
probably smoothed it
issues,
over.
they compared, and on the resurrection for one, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, I sat down with James, the brother of Jesus. I also sat down with Peter and compared notes to make sure that what I was teaching was the same thing they had said.
And that's what Gary Habermas says. He has a Greek word for it, which is really.
So Bill, what's your standard to judge whether something should be trustworthy or not in the New Testament?
Well, this was not just one or two people. This was like 50 or so scholars.
No, I'm asking you because you like Ron, throws it up there and says, well, you believe that they really did argue over who set right. Like,
Right.
oh yeah, that's trustworthy. We can believe that.
Sure.
But we can't trust other things from.
Well, like the birth narratives, like Matthew has, wise men, and Luke has shepherds. And when you see your little manger scenes, what they do is they just conflate them and put their shepherds in the wise men in the same manger.
But it can't be both. They both can't be.
Well,
we know it
anything
wasn't
can
at the-
happen, but
we
they
know it's not at
probably-
the same time. I think no Christian scholar thinks
No,
that
it's
happened
just
at the same
two
time.
different viewpoints. Matthew has them going to Egypt. I mean, it's just you cannot reconcile these two birth narratives. That's why when I was at UNC taking the Legends class, I looked on the board. The birth narratives are fiction. Like everybody knows that in scholarship, just about like everybody knows that he's an apocalyptic figure. He had a bad week.
Did Bart Ehrman teach that?
I know, it was just somebody else there. It's just the people in real schools, like Princeton, like in California, they know that not Biola. Don't sign a statement that says, I believe in every word of the Bible. Am I right to it? Now, don't you guys believe, you're talking about a hard line. You believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, right? What's your doctrinal statement?
Define it.
Inerrant, infallible, which doesn't infallible mean it's not even capable of being wrong? Well, tell me what.
Yeah, I don't really know how to approach inerrancy and infallibility and things.
So what would you say, Brady, as far as the inerrancy of the Bible?
Tape's running.
Yeah, I believe the Bible's inerrant. It's without error.
Okay. So see.
Well, because like even the stuff you're saying about Quirinius, there's three different solutions that you can even look at.
Bogus solutions that he was.
No, well,
he
some
was
of it's
the
in the
ruler
Greek.
2 different times.
Well, how about in the Greek where it says protos? That could mean before. And so, but not to mention the fact that we have reasonable evidence to believe that he actually served in 2 different periods of time.
I don't believe that.
It's only a
seen
completely
the
Well,
different
evidence?
part.
it's within the realm of possibility because look at Jerry Brown. He was a governor of California from 40 years ago. Then there were several other governors after him, and now he's governor of California.
Yeah,
again.
I've looked at the evidence, and it clearly he only ruled once.
Can I challenge you?
Part of the
on one
answer may
thing?
be in the language
Yeah,
too,
sure.
though, because
Still, he's smarter than me.
so part of the answer may be in the language, because what he's called there in terms of his leadership position isn't the word that would ordinarily be used for it. The governor. It would be for a military type of person. And we do know that in that earlier time frame that he was a military leader in that area. And we know from the writings of Augustus that there were multiple large-scale censuses, not worldwide, but large-scale for the area, including one as early as 8 BC. And so if you have a raggedy area like Judah with a whole bunch of rebellious Jews, you know, this is an imperial province, not a senatorial province, because they can't keep these guys under control. Who would you have conduct the census? It'd be the military guy who can keep these raggedy Jews in control.
Is that what you were going to say?
I was actually I've talked to Dr. Stilley about the census thing because you keep bringing up that it's a bogus census, but we have historical evidence, like good historical evidence, that there was a census. It's not scriptural evidence.
Oh, no, they had census all the time. It just wasn't this
no.
thing where you go to your ancestors' hometown 1,000 years before.
No, I'm talking about that specific, like that very specific census we have evidence for, not just like, well, sure, censuses happen. We all know. I'm talking literally about that specific census.
Yeah, part of this is the language of the day when it says all the world is taxed. You go, that we know that's not true because they hadn't even discovered the New World yet. Well, that in their mind, that's what they would call it.
Yeah, that's not what they mean.
Their world, you know.
I would have to challenge you on the take up my cross thing, because there is a presumption on your part that Jesus had no foreknowledge and he was just a regular guy. But if you take the Christian view that he was the Son of God, that's not ridiculous that he would.
Oh, no, if you take that view, sure.
But I'm just saying you can't prove your argument by assuming.
No, that's what, in this book they list their presuppositions. You know,
Now he is right that failed messianic prophets were a dime a dozen in the first century.
Yeah.
And they were constantly rising and falling and getting crucified and other things. But what makes Jesus unique? You never have the story of the crucifixion followed by a resurrection, and very few of these failed apocalyptic prophets have world religions.
Do you think that was a good answer to my question? That the difference is, sure, lots of apocalyptic prophets just died. You know, I mean, one guy who used to go, here from the east, here from the west, Jerusalem's going to fall. I think his name was Jesus too. He's like 30 years after Jesus. And he was just a nutcase, and they beat him like to an inch of his life. And he actually ended up dying in the Jewish war, you know, and so forth. But he's a nut, and they didn't crucify him; they just beat him. Can you imagine how off the wall Jesus was? But anyway, here's the scriptural support from the real Bible. Luke 14. If any come to me and do not hate their own father, this is in red. Jesus actually said this. And mother, and wife, and children, and brothers, and sisters, yes, even their own life, they cannot be my disciples. That's in red. Here's what's in this is the second verse. You have one in red, one in black. Those who do not carry their own cross and come after me cannot be my disciples. Clearly, Jesus didn't say that.
Well, I'm
In the opinion of-
Because he said they carry their own cross.
But do you understand what that statement means when he says carry your own cross within the cultural context?
It could be.
Or do you want one of my guys, Helen?
Go
I
ahead.
don't know if y'all. I'm not going to put them on the spot. I'm teasing them. But
Bear your own burden.
Why did no? Why did the Romans make them carry their cross to the crucifixion?
Because
site?
they're subjugated.
Okay, and what was that telling? What was that supposed to be?
You tell me.
Statement.
Submission?
It was a statement of Rome is right, I'm wrong, I'm deserving of this punishment. And so, for Jesus to say, pick up your cross and follow me, that's not a popular thing to say. What he's saying is we as Christians say, God is right, I'm wrong, I'm following him.
Okay. So
Let me say this. Interesting, but we need to really take a break. So if we could take about, let's say, 5 minutes and stretch. There's some coffee in there, some other drinks, and all. And
Backing out. Isn't it like kind of just retreating, backing out, shifting your stance?
well, special plea. You can explain to me.
yes, special pleadings, different variations of it. Basically, I understand it as being like you give your worldview a special dispensation that you don't give others. So I will say, Christianity is true because of this. Well, can't Islam be true for the same reason? Well, no, not Islam. I'm not going to give them that opportunity. Well, that's special pleading. I'm not going to apply that to every religion, just only my own religion.
And here's a perfect example. In Islam, you got crazy things like Allah splitting the moon in half, or going up to heaven in a winged horse. You know more about this. So we look at it as, when I used to be a Christian, I thought, those crazy Muslims, nobody believes that stuff, or the Hindus creating the world in the back of a turtle. But no, our Mr. Ed talking donkey in Balaam, you know, where the donkey talks, oh, that makes perfect sense. And Jesus walking away, oh, of course that's true. So that's special pleading because we're so engulfed by our culture, and we see through the eyes of the Christian's culture, it looks nuts to them. Well, our thing with the Trinity looks nuts to Muslims. You know, so
what would give you an example of atheist special pleading?
Ooh, that hurts.
I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I'm sure there are.
I'm thinking I can't.
No, we're just totally unbiased and fair.
Well, like I said last month, we're not without bias, but I think we're less so inherently than believers. Because, like I was saying in the kitchen just now, we're more disinterested. Most of us are. Some of us do have an agenda. I don't. Many don't. But we're a disinterested party where I would turn on a dime if enough evidence was convincing enough. I'd walk out of here a Christian right now.
Well, Chris, I mean, you used to be a Christian.
I doubt
you
this.
an unbiased, disinterested observer?
Not as much as I'd like to be, I'm sure.
But can you look at it more?
Sam Harris would say there's no such thing.
Yeah, I mean, I try and be logical, but I have my own emotional attachments, and I have my own history, and
It's kind of how
And-
the
and
video
it-
turns. It's kind of how the video plays into it.
And it gets absolutely ridiculous
Video
with
that I was talking
Christians. There's a guy named Alvin Plantinga. I don't know if you've heard of him. I'm sure you have. He's a philosopher. And he goes and says, one of his big things is Christianity is properly basic. It's warranted belief. It's like, really? I mean, don't you think Muslims think theirs is properly basic and
Yeah,
warranted?
I've heard that. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't
Thank
really
you.
think that's.
But it's saying that there's something
I
so.
understand his reasoning, but
I mean, properly basic. He means like beauty and mathematics. That's how basic. And you don't even have to explain it or defend it. Christianity, am I right?
I think he's referring to the existence of God, maybe not Christianity in particular, and I would be more sympathetic with that than Christianity.
Right. Thank you.
I
You
think
need a definition of properly basic.
Yeah,
in
he also
context.
gives, like, we're kind of misrepresenting, I think,
That's in
slightly.
the deep waters of philosophy. I don't swim.
It's self-evidential. It doesn't require. If you say 1 + 1 is 2, you don't mount a philosophical reasoning for that. You don't have to. It's just a basic brute fact. You know. So even though philosophically there's no such thing. You know. So 1 + 1 always seems to work so far. So we assume it's going to continue to work, but then we haven't proven that.
It is a construct, though.
Yeah.
Well, I think therefore I exist. You might put that as actually a properly basic.
Would
Yeah.
you say, Bill, that maybe the anti-supernatural bias could fit into what we were talking about before?
Sure.
Because to me, it seems like, regardless of if there was a God or not, the universe coming into being from whatever, I'm not even arguing or caring about first cause, would just seem like a miraculous event if it was the only time it's happened kind of thing. So I just feel like maybe the anti-supernatural
Well,
bias
and the
is kind of-
anti-supernatural bias has been around since the great German theologians like Boltmann, with the demythologizers, where they say anything supernatural, Jesus walking the water, calming a storm. Obviously, you can't do that. They just throw that out. And then they look at the
So we
other
look at
things
tool for
like
measuring
It's
it,
an
so we don't know if it's
outpouring
natural
of-
or
I mean,
supernatural.
It's sourced out of the Enlightenment, and a lot of things that came out of the Enlightenment were very good things and stuff. But maybe the pendulum swing too far. That it's by definition false if it's supernatural.
Relativity
The
and
problem is we don't really know for sure what's
quantum theory.
supernatural.
Meet both of them.
What would you say?
Would an atheist
At the
special
singularity.
pleading be almost a supernatural kind of
No, that's a great
creative
point.
power of natural processes?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That would be special pleading from the atheists. But wouldn't you agree, Jim?
About what he
Yeah,
just said?
yeah,
Oh, what I was just saying.
Aren't we doing special
Quantum
pleading?
mechanics and relativity break down at the singularity at t = 0. So science doesn't work. We don't have a tool for measuring anything that or before that. Before that is an illogical statement because there was no time before that. So we don't have a tool for measuring that, so therefore we can't say it's supernatural or natural.
Well,
So
even-
we have no frame of reference.
Well, even after that, the formation of galaxies and stars, and there's a lot of miraculous.
You said anti-supernatural bias. Sorry. Go ahead, Truett. Yeah.
So how would maybe a miraculous kind of creative power of natural processes?
We'll say it one more time.
A miraculous kind of creative ability of
What does that look like? I would have to get a description. I'd have to get an example.
Creating order.
Well, no, all you need is hydrogen. In the beginning was hydrogen.
Chaos creating order?
Right.
Yeah. Well,
In what system does chaos create order?
Well, bang, creating
No,
order.
in the beginning was
And then you have
hydrogen, then
sterling.
you have two supernova explosions, which creates, James would agree with this, that create carbon and the heavy metals, right? So you don't need...
Or like, swirling
Nova,
debris
third
creating
generation
third
star in
generation.
order to get
But
farther.
back to the point, the anti-intellectual bias, the anti-supernatural bias, we would have to identify if that is even possible to be supernatural or natural. We don't even know either.
But that's not my point.
You're saying,
No, my point is that that would be considered a miracle based off of how we define miracles, in that you don't see them happen normally in the natural world.
it's only
But that's
happened
only-
once
that's
ever,
my
as far
whole-
as we know, right?
That's my entire
Okay,
point.
I
That's
see.
only happened
Well, that's a
once.
good
So
point.
to say that it can't, and I'm not saying anybody here
Yeah.
is having that anti-supernatural bias. I was saying, is that an example that
Especially
of the
we believe that only
atheist?
one man rose once, and
Yeah.
Are there atheists that just, no matter what you say, I'm not going to believe in the supernatural because it's not natural, and I'm so married to science that I think it will eventually
Well,
solve
James
all
did
our
answer.
problems? Yes,
James did answer.
those
I've
exist.
interviewed atheists that told
Those
me
people
that.
exist,
He interviewed
yes.
Matt Dillahunty, and he just wasn't open to it.
Yeah, yeah.
And we had Aaron Rod.
I think Aaron Ra falls in that category to some degree. I asked him, well, it was more the Matt Dillahunty. I asked him, interviewed him after one of those door debates, and he said he just did not see the evidence he would expect to see if Jesus rose from the dead. There should be more evidence. You just have this collection of. I just asked him, could you give me a picture of what it would look like? Let's say it really did happen, first century man, really did rise from the dead. It was transformational in many people's lives. They wanted to preserve it. Obviously, we don't have we don't have a video. We don't have a Facebook page. So what would it look like for first century people if they witnessed a real event? What evidence we have today? And he thought about it a second. He said, basically, I don't think there is a possible way of putting any evidence that would be convincing. So he's basically asking for something that even if he was to construct it, could not exist. And that what I would call supernatural, anti-supernatural bias.
By the way, we're ready for Jim's question, right?
Well, Jim, are you ready for this one?
okay.
I think you're next.
Oh, is that next one? All right.
Yeah, I think you're up next. So this is, and this is
No,
short. I
it's
think this
so
is like 9
juvenile.
minutes.
Don't be, it's not scholarly at all.
He's gonna dismiss you.
It's original
There's two here.
sin
I don't know
stuff.
if yours is first or not. I can't remember. I've got a question here from Jim Hall, one of our atheist members. He's also the host of his own program, The Atheist Edge. And he said that on page 201 of the Kindle version, you distill the Bible into 4 main acts: the act of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And so his question, is it obligatory to accept the literal accounts of origin? In other words, can someone still be a Christian if they believe the Garden of Eden stories to simply be symbolic or allegorical? And this kind of relates to the earlier question, I think. If so, why was a vicarious redemption in the form of a 39-hour death necessary to save us from a sinful nature that was baked in from the beginning? And he adds, I really enjoyed the book and look forward to your response. So, if you can accept some of it as being allegorical and still be a Christian, why not the whole redemption cross? Why don't you also look at that as some kind of allegory instead of actually redemptive?
Okay, I mean, so I understood Jim's question, and I think it's a great question again. Just to take them in order, he says, is it obligatory to accept a literal account of origins, i.e. creation story? Can someone still be a Christian if they believe the Garden of Eden stories to be simply symbolic or allegorical? I mean, my simple answer would be yes, someone can be a Christian if you believe the Garden of Eden stories to be simply symbolic or allegorical, because what being a Christian requires is trusting in Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection. It doesn't require you to have a very specific doctrine of the Old Testament or the creation story. Having said that, I think it's important for us to take seriously the Old Testament and the creation stories, and to come to some kind of a view of how we should understand them and interpret them. And I think, it's my view is that the creation story is a different kind of account or narrative than you find in other parts of Scripture. And so you've got something going on in Genesis 1 and 2, which is inevitably, in a way it's written down, more poetic. And I wouldn't necessarily say that we're meant to understand that as a sort of a narrative about a scientific narrative specifically about how things happen, but more a narrative about why things happen, the purposes that God has in creation and so on. Now, that doesn't mean that I simply take it as symbolic or allegorical. I think that something is going on. There's some kind of creative act going on, but they're representing it in a way that makes sense within their time frame, and which actually still makes sense in our time frame. But I find the creation story somehow transcends, the millennia, and still speaks to us today in ways that other types of literature of such an ancient form don't. So I find something quite remarkable about that in the creation story. But where I guess I didn't want to, in a sense, in the book, get into any detailed discussions about different ways to interpret those early chapters of Genesis. Rather, I simply wanted to make the point that however you think you should interpret that story, what we find ourselves in is a world which is not as it should be. You only have to turn on the news to see that the world is in a state, and whether you are a Christian or not a Christian, most people will say this isn't the way it should be. And equally, we can look at ourselves and say we're not the way we should be. And for me, that points to something fairly important, which is that we all recognize, in a sense, that we live in a fallen world. Whether we call it that or not, we all sense that the world is not the way it should be. My view as a Christian is that goes back to an act when there was some kind of a rebellion, when there was a move away from God and away from the way God wants the world to be. And in the sense that we carry that around in ourselves, we have this sinful nature, we have this, this nature where we know that we should be doing things and we don't do them. We kind of have a fallen nature within us. And again, I just think that each of those acts, if you like, of fall and creation and fall and redemption and restoration can all be seen by any person, whether they're a Christian or not, as having some. They're there in the world around us.
It's a theme that runs through history, apparently. No matter how you interpret or even believe in Genesis.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that when we look at the world, we see a fallen world, we see a world that is in need of redemption. The atheist has one story about how that can happen, and it's a story that I don't find very convincing, because it's a story that is often premised on some kind of humanistic worldview where we'll, by our own efforts, make this world a better place. But that experiment has been tried many times and it always falls flat. People are people. They're flawed, fallen, broken people, and we just can't seem to do it in our own strength. That's where the Christian story for me has overwhelmingly proved itself, because wherever you look around the world where people are trying to be to do that Christian story of redemption and restoration, it's because they're inspired by this man Jesus, who claimed to be God's vehicle of redemption and restoration himself. So when it comes to the question about, why should Jesus' death, why should it be necessary to save us from our sinful nature that was baked in from the beginning? Well, given that we can all recognize that we have this sinful nature, whether we call it that thing or not, but this fallenness, for me, Jesus is God stepping in to rescue us from ourselves, essentially, to rescue us from the consequences of the kind of world that we create when we do that. And so Jesus, in his death, takes on the consequences of our sinfulness, of our rebellion. He suffers that all so that we can enter into this new relationship with God. This and forgiveness, in that sense, is it always comes at a cost. I think you see that in any relationship. If a husband betrays his wife, now if she forgives him and takes him back, it's not at no cost. It's not something you just say, well, I forgive you. It comes at an immense cost. Every time an act of forgiveness takes place, there is a cost to someone. And in the case of
why
God,
it goes beyond metaphor. This is the cross, the death and resurrection. You would say you can't just say that's merely symbolic or metaphorical. That there was actually an atonement or some type of forgiveness taking place in the act.
Completely. So, and I would very much distinguish. I think with the early chapters of Genesis, if you want to look at them in some kind of allegorical or poetic way, I think there's room for that. But that's because of the type of literature you're looking at, the genre of literature. When you're looking at the Gospels, you're looking at a very different type of literature. You're looking at a historical genre of literature in which things happened, in which a man called Jesus claimed to be the Son of God, in which he got himself crucified for it, and in which his followers claimed that he appeared to them again afterwards and was raised from the dead, and which had enormous ramifications for this new movement that emerged called the church. And so for me, yes, you can't just sort of somehow say, oh, well, if that bit was allegorical, then the rest must be allegorical. And no, absolutely, there's a very real sense in which God, the central claim of Christianity is that God has acted in the world. He's done something in history which was definitive and changed the course of the world forever. So for me, that, you know, but the question specifically that the person was asking was around sort of, I think, why did Jesus need to be sacrificed in order to redeem us, this vicarious redemption? And I just think that is the nature. It's a huge mystery, and I'm in the short time we've got, I'm not going to even attempt to answer, give you a very detailed explanation. But I think at the centre of everything there is love, and love involves giving yourself, and so God gives himself for his own creation in order to bring it back to that state in which he wants it. And that involves a cost, and he bears the cost himself. And anyone who trusts in Jesus receives that forgiveness, receives that newness, that new start, and everything else. But there's 100 different ways of expressing it, and for me, that's both the mystery and the joy of the cross. Is it can be expressed in any number of different ways.
An unholy thing. An unholy thing.